This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I'm not in college. I'm not at university. I'm not in grad school. I'm not pursuing my PhD. But it sort of feels like I am. But here's the tricky part. I'm not in some niche, right? I get to talk to everyone. It's the coolest damn thing. Now, here's a little secret about how I pursue my process. I think everybody I talk to is connected in some way, at least in my maniacal mind. I think it's all connected because it starts with skepticism. You start with skepticism, you go down a path, and you figure out an aha moment. And then you're left with something really cool that's useful for everyone, regardless of their endeavor in life. Oh, you're a trader, you're a trend-following trader, you're a short-term trader, you're an entrepreneur, you're a business person, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer. Hey, guess what? Oh, I forgot one also. You're a student. You're just a regular person. You're working at Starbucks. The episode today, I would like to make the argument that all of my episodes are the same in this context. But this episode today, it's for everyone. Because the topic of the conversation is something that we all have to deal with every day or we die. And what's that? Sleep. My guest today is Matthew Walker, British scientist, professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on the impact of sleep on human health and disease. I got lucky. I randomly caught Matt on Joe Rogan's show. Did not know anything about Matt, had not seen his book, dropped him an email, and I quickly realized that Matt is talking to a lot of people right now. He is getting this message out. So I was so happy that I'm kind of a little late to the party, but Matt graciously responded, said, sure, I'll come on the podcast. Once again, I'm a lucky guy to be able to have all these expert minds on. And we are all lucky too, because you know what? Today, I'm giving you the absolute best way you can increase your performance. That's one aspect. And increase all of those things that connect to your human biology, your lifespan, your potential for disease, controlling and shaping your own DNA. Yeah, it's all through sleep. And my guest today, Matthew Walker, he's really laid down the gauntlet with all of us. You can listen or you can not listen. And for those of you that don't listen, what's wrong with you? I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Matthew Walker. So Matthew, in preparation for talking to you today, I did one little post on my Facebook. I said, hey, I actually didn't even say I was going to be having initially a conversation with anybody. I just said, look, if you're only getting 6 hours a night and you think it's enough, it's not enough. A fairly innocuous type statement. You would think most people instinctively know this, right? Oh my gosh, over 100 comments, got people in there screaming and yelling. You would have thought I had thrown down the gauntlet. One of the things that someone said as I kind of lead into this question, which was really interesting, is they said, well, you know, Tony Robbins has come out. And I love Tony Robbins. I think he's great things to say. You know, he says, Tony comes out, he says, he gets like, 5 or 6 or less or something at peak optimization. He works fine at it. It works for him. Now, of course, there's always the outliers and the bell curve and all that kind of fun stuff. But I thought to myself, all of this angst that was existing on my Facebook thread, there was a certain level of machismo, like, I can just outwill this thing. And it felt very testosterone filled, right? And the funny thing is here I have all these guys that are showing their testosterone about how little sleep they need and the reality.
The irony.
Why don't you explain that irony?
Yeah, well, we know that men who are sleeping 6 hours or less a night will actually have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior. That insufficient sleep that they are so proudly boasting about is actually serving to age them by a decade in terms of that aspect of virility and wellness. So unfortunately, the data is not supportive. And I would like to come back to the comment about those outliers, maybe Tony Robinson, people have before quoted to me Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, all short sleepers. The danger there is you're taking a sample of one person and then you're trying to apply it to the masses, rather than actually taking tens of thousands of scientific studies and looking at what those studies actually tell you. So I would tend to suggest people follow trend lines and not headlines. And headlines in this case is an individual. Trend lines is the science. And by the way, you noted too that people are fighting against this evolutionary mandate of 8 hours of sleep a night. And all I would say is that if science has taught us anything, whenever you fight biology, you normally lose. And the way that you know you've lost is through disease and sickness.
That was the thing that seemed to be missing on the responses to me, is the guys kept coming back about performance. I can kind of just push through to get to the performance. And I kept saying, hey, hold on. What about the biological elements going on here? They weren't even considering the aging, the potential dementia, the Alzheimer's, the high blood pressure, the potential heart attacks, cancer risks. They weren't even considering that. It was only, I can push through to the performance.
Well, I think the phrase push through is critical here. Are you optimal or are you just pushing through? And second, one of the other things that we know is that your subjective sense of how well you're doing when you're not getting sufficient sleep is a miserable predictor of objectively actually how well you are doing when you're not getting enough sleep. In other words, you don't know you're sleep deprived when you're sleep deprived. So I think the analogy would be, a drunk driver at a bar. They've had 6 shots and they pick up their car keys. They say, look, I'm fine to drive home. And your response is, no, I know that subjectively you think you're fine to drive, but trust me, objectively, you're not. It's the same way with insufficient sleep. And that's why I usually imagine people who say those things truly just don't understand the performance deficit at that stage.
Let's start with a big picture. We've talked about numbers for a moment, but I think it'll really help those people that are unfamiliar with your work, unfamiliar with, frankly, the right way to sleep. Let's talk about that optimal number. I think I've seen you say the range is 7 to 9. Anything below 7, you can measure the impairment.
That's right. Yeah. So we know that once average human beings drop below that 7 number, that's when we can actually observe changes both in the brain and the body. But for example, if I were to put an individual on 7 hours of sleep for 3 weeks, at that stage, they would be as impaired in terms of their driving performance as they would be after one night of total sleep deprivation after going without sleep for 36 hours. So it's like compounding interest on a loan. It just aggregates and aggregates.
Hold on, you said it's 7 hours it does that.
Yeah. We know that 1 out of every 2 people in most developed nations is actually trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less during the week. If I take you down to that level, it only takes 2 weeks to become as cognitively impaired as you would be after pulling an all-nighter.
Yeah, the all-nighter thing, I think back to my college days as a professor. You might laugh at this, but never one time, and I wasn't the greatest student, but that's a whole different issue, but never one time did I attempt to pull an all-nighter because instinctively, even though I did not have the knowledge that exists in your work, instinctively I knew I was useless if I tried to stay up all night.
Exactly that. And you can see that in performance. We did a study where we asked, in terms of learning and memory, is it a good idea to pull the all-nighter? So we took 2 groups of healthy adults. We gave one group a full night of sleep, the other we sleep deprived. And then we looked at how well they could cram facts into the brain the next day. And firstly, what we found is that when you are sleep deprived, your brain is 40% worse at learning new material. So 40. To put that in context of an exam, it would be the difference between acing it and failing it miserably. But what we also found, which was quite disturbing, is why the learning change was associated with a change in the brain. And specifically, there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is almost like a memory inbox for the brain. that part of your brain was actually shut down when you were sleep deprived. So any new incoming memories were just being bounced. So you couldn't effectively commit new experiences to memory.
It is absolutely fascinating, the path that you've gone down. And before I dig even deeper, I want you to paint for me the passion. Now, you're my second psych guest from Berkeley. I had Alison Gopnik on, and she was great.
Wonderful.
She was fantastic. But what has been the driver for you? I want to lay this foundation. You're a very passionate guy. You've obviously gone down this. I mean, as an outsider looking in, I look at this path and I'm like, it's just so cool to see somebody go down a path that many people are not exploring and put something out that, frankly, I don't care where somebody sits on the political spectrum. This is useful information for everyone. And gosh, in such a polarized society, it's nice to have something where we can all perhaps say, oh my gosh, we can all talk about this. How did you get this passion? How did this start for you?
I think for a number of different reasons. Firstly, we know now that I think the global sleep loss epidemic is perhaps one of the greatest public health challenges that we now face in the 21st century. And I don't make that statement flippantly. We've got remarkable health challenges. We've got obesity, diabetes, we've got cancer, Alzheimer's disease. All of those individual disease states are desperately problematic. The issue, however, is that a lack of sleep sits like a superordinate node above all of those things. It's linked to every single disease that is killing us in the developed world, insufficient sleep. So by itself, it, I think, consumes more lives relative to any one of those in isolation. That was the first thing. The second thing was that if you look at this decline of sleep, this great depression of sleep over the last 100 years, it's staggering. Gallup did a poll in 1942, and they demonstrated that the average American adult was sleeping 7.9 hours a night. Now that number is down to only 6 hours and 31 minutes. In other words, within the space of 80 or 90 years, we have lopped off almost 20% of this mandated sleep need. It took Mother Nature 3.6 million years to put this essential thing called 8 hours of sleep in place. And we've just done away with, 20%, 25% of that. How could it not come with demonstrable health consequences, which it is? I just felt as though that message has not been adequately communicated to the public. So let me come back to your Twitter feed. A lot of people just didn't understand why proclaiming how they are doing fine on 6 hours and not worrying about the disease risk. Part of the reason is not just the sleep machismo attitude, which there is, and it's a problem, but it's the fault of people like me. I have not done or had not done a good job of describing the science of sleep, which we have known now for almost 30 years. And I think we are with our lack of sleep where we were with smoking 30 or 40 years ago. We knew all of the science, the carcinogenic, the cardiovascular consequences, but that data had not been out there. So society had not changed its beliefs and attitudes and behavior. It was only when science took 30 years to finally communicate publicly that data did we make a change, and we saved millions of lives. That's what needs to happen with sleep. That was the motivation to write the book. That's been the motivation to become much more of a public figure. I'm a very introverted person. Normally, I don't like being in the spotlight, but I feel so compelled because the disease and suffering that is present in the world right now because of our lack of sleep is so painful. It's not necessary. It's one of the greatest preventable diseases that nobody is talking about and no one is trying to solve.
We're going to have to talk about a lot of different things today that are just eye-opening, and perhaps somebody could frame it as negative. I look at your work, and I've actually seen you kind of say, hey, you've talked to audiences and you say, oh my gosh, I'm going to throw a lot of things at you today that might sound heavy, might not sound so nice. But there's another way to kind of look at this too, that once one absorbs your work, it's like, okay, oh my gosh, if I make certain choices, I get this performance boost that helps me on the performance of what I want to do in my life. It helps me on how long I want to live. How long I want to live, if I'm looking at your work correctly, is, from a bell curve perspective, is a choice when it comes to sleep, isn't it?
It's absolutely a choice. For most people, I think for some people, it may not be a choice. And I specifically am talking about people with sleep disorders, where that obviously isn't a choice. And also some people from a socioeconomic perspective may just not be given through their work pressures the ability to sleep. But for the most part, I would say 90 to 95% of people who are underslept can do something about that. And you're right about the lifespan issue. What we know is the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. Short sleep predicts all-cause mortality. If you adopt that mindset of this idea, I can sleep when I'm dead, well, it is mortally unwise advice, and you will be both dead sooner and the quality of your now shorter life will be significantly worse. That's what epidemiological studies teach us.
Matthew, in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years going back in America, and it's different for other countries, but America's had this huge debate about healthcare and whether the healthcare should be private or public. And these debates, I can understand the different positions on different sides of the fences and all that kind of stuff. But what I never hear is something tangible. I never hear like a politician or a leader come out and start to talk about something like sleep. We can sit here, you and I can have this intellectual conversation about this, how important it is. It doesn't make a difference whether somebody is on the right or left. This is just fact. And how we can't get that to a higher level conversation where like literally the leaders of the free world should be giving national speeches about this topic, in my humble opinion. Am I completely nuts?
No, if the goal of any head of a nation is to try and improve the wealth and the health and the lifespan of their people, sleep should be one of their top priorities. Absolutely. That's what the data supports. Wealth as well. And I'd love to at some point dive into why less sleep does not equal more productivity. And in fact, sound sleep is sound business. But I'll come back to your question, though, which is a governmental one. I have been lobbying and been very vocal in every opportunity, and I'll take it here as well, to appeal to any first world nation that wants to work with me, because I have not yet seen any first world government that has issued a public health campaign regarding insufficient sleep. And it's puzzling because many of those countries have had wonderful public health movement conversations regarding eating, regarding exercise, regarding things like flu vaccination, regarding drink driving, drugs of abuse. Where is the missing piece in that puzzle? That is sleep. Sleep is the neglected stepsister in the health conversation of today, and it is not on the priority list of any government. They could make demonstrable changes that would save them as a government huge amounts of money. And I'll give you a fact. The Rand Corporation, an independent survey group, looked at the enormous cost of sleep deprivation in many first world nations. What they found was that a lack of sleep costs most nations about 2% of their GDP. In America, that was $411 billion. In Japan, it was $138 billion. In the United Kingdom, my home country, it was $50 billion. If you solve the sleep loss epidemic within countries, you could almost double the budget for education, or you could halve the healthcare deficit in some of these countries.
So let's open up some of the contradictions and conflicts with what you describe. If I walk into any airport around this world, one of the primary things they are attempting to sell to me, and look, I'm a guy who's approaching 50. I'm a yoga nut. I drink maybe one beer a month if I'm lucky. Okay, so I'm not saying I'm all that. I'm just saying that's what I'm describing. So look, if I walk into that airport, though, all I see are racks and racks and racks of brown, and I want to throw an expletive here, but I won't, but I see racks and racks and racks of brown liquor, right? And so all these people are buying this brown liquor. So even if we go out there, we have all these governments say, hey, here's the right way to do it. Then they go to the airport, they buy the bottle of brown liquor, they go home, they guzzle it down, and what happens to their sleep, Professor?
Well, alcohol is probably one of the most misunderstood drugs when it comes to sleep. It's commonly used as a sleep aid. Many people turn to alcohol when over-the-counter sleep aids fail for them. They think it helps them fall asleep more quickly. It doesn't. Unfortunately, alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation is not sleep. So all you're doing when you have a nightcap is actually just knocking out your brain, specifically the cortex, which sits on top of the brain. So firstly, you're not getting natural sleep. when you're drinking alcohol. But then there are two other problems. Firstly, alcohol will fragment your sleep throughout the night, so you wake up many more times. The problem is that they are so brief that they tend not to be remembered. But when you wake up the next morning, you feel lousy, you don't feel refreshed, you don't feel restored, but you never link two and two together because you don't remember waking up so much. If those two things weren't bad enough, unfortunately, and this makes me deeply unpopular, by the way.
No, not with me. Not with me. I don't drink, so.
But it's okay. For the most part, I'm an unpopular guy anyway, so I guess I can't. I'm already at floor levels. The final problem with alcohol with sleep is that it will actually block your REM sleep, or what we call your rapid eye movement sleep, which is essential for a number of brain functions, including creativity, insight, problem solving, as well as emotional and mental health. When you add all of those three things together, alcohol is a profoundly sleep disruptive drug. And if you want good sleep, it's to be abstained from. Of course, I don't want to be puritanical. Life, to some degree, is to be lived. But all I'm here to do is try to describe the science and what we know to be truth, and then allow people to make an informed choice with their behaviors.
Life is to be lived, but it's going to be a shorter life if everyone goes down some of these paths.
It is. And, I think, some of the comments I've sometimes had from media that I've done, people will say, well, yes, but if I'm sleeping just 6 hours a night versus 8 hours, I'm awake for 2 hours every day. Maybe I'll die at 60, but if I get 2 hours extra every day, then I'm still probably going to have just as much life as I would do if I slept 8 hours. Firstly, the problem with that is those years that you have lived are going to be more unhealthy. So you're going to have a shorter lifespan, but more importantly, you're going to have a shorter health span. The other thing is that, yes, you may be awake for longer, but you're also going to be largely in a stupor because you're so sleep deprived. So I don't think it's the type of quality, it would be like watching a YouTube that is, on 144 DPI. Why would you do that when you could watch it at 1080 high resolution? That's what a full 8 hours of sleep actually is.
I saw you on a national TV broadcast, a morning show, and it seemed to me some of the questions, and one of the host was asking, he was older and he was asking some questions. And I just he felt so obligatory, like meaning, okay, we got the sleep guy here. Let's ask him some questions and move on to the next segment. I mean, there was just I guess I see your point where some people don't like what you're having to say, because I guess I've witnessed it in my own preparation for this conversation. So it's really amazing that people aren't more open-minded, because it's fascinating that once people go, like yourself, researchers go down this path, figure all this out, smart people should say, oh my gosh, this is great. Let's adopt this.
One of the potential problems here is that people become so used to feeling as though they are okay with 6 hours that they can't believe that they need more. But what's remarkable, I get this a lot on social media. People say, okay, I heard Matt speak, and I decided to try the experiment. I tried getting, 8 hours of sleep opportunity every night. And my goodness, I never realized I could feel this way. So I think that's the first thing, this misbelief that 8 hours will actually give you something more than you're currently feeling, because you've reset your baseline into this kind of dull state of non-optimality, and you don't realize that you can be so much more. A lot of people say, well, this is just me at age 50. If you get 8 hours at age 50, you may actually start feeling 40. But I think the other problem, though, in terms of the pushback, is that sleep has an image problem. That in society in this day and age, we equate getting sufficient sleep with this concept of laziness, that if you're getting 8 hours of sleep, then you're slothful. It's surprising to me for at least two reasons. Firstly, human beings are the only species that will deliberately deprive themselves of sleep for no apparent good reason. And second, even we human beings don't always hold that attitude of sleep being useless, because no one looks at a baby sleeping during the day and says, well, what a lazy baby. And we don't, because we know that sleep at that time of life is non-negotiable. It's absolutely essential. But if you look at the data, somewhere now between infancy and even childhood, we abandon the notion that sleep is important and necessary and to be celebrated and embraced, and we chastise it and we stigmatize it with this label of laziness. And I think that that's a huge problem. I think that's one one of the biggest challenges that I face.
So Matthew, in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, all the rage has been the legalization of marijuana across various states. And I have smoked marijuana. When I was younger, I tried whatever, I just didn't like the feeling of smoke in my body, whether it's a cigarette or marijuana or whatever. But look, plenty of people do. And back to the alcohol point. What's marijuana doing to sleep? I mean, if everybody right now thinks it's wonderful that there's all these publicly traded companies and we could all make all this money buying marijuana, but everyone's stoned, what's happening to all those folks that think there's no ramifications to getting high on their sleep?
Marijuana does actually speed up the time it takes you to fall asleep. It's called your sleep onset latency, which just means how long does it take you to fall asleep? And people seem to fall asleep in a shorter amount of time. The problem, however, with marijuana is that, like alcohol, but through a different mechanism, it also seems to block rapid eye movement sleep or dream sleep too. One of the problems there comes back to mental health issues. We and others have done studies where you will selectively deprive individuals of this thing called rapid eye movement sleep, which is otherwise known as dream sleep. And if you do that night after night, just selectively depriving them of rapid eye movement sleep, so they still sleep maybe 7.5 hours, but you've just prevented them from getting any dream sleep, because as soon as they go into dream sleep, we go into the room in the sleep center, we wake them up, and then they fall back asleep, we wake them up again. After about 3 or 4 days of that, people start to have hallucinations and delusions, and essentially they start to show signs of going into psychosis. They become psychotic, believing things that aren't true. They have paranoia, seeing things which are not there. You could imagine that if there is something like alcohol or marijuana that is routinely and chronically depriving your brain of REM sleep, it may heighten your risk for aspects of psychosis and mental health disorders. So I think it's one of those unspoken about dangers when it comes to those drugs. Now, we also don't know if some of the other variants of marijuana, looking at CBD oil, for example, some people use that, which doesn't necessarily have the euphoric sort of feelings that come along with classic marijuana. We don't know what those things like CBD oil actually do to sleep and whether or not they are less disruptive. So could you still get some of the speeding up of the time that it takes you to fall asleep, but without the detrimental blocking of REM sleep? We don't know. That's unclear right now, but people should be aware of that.
Let me keep down the path of a couple more of these big picture issues that affect our sleep that we all really don't think about so much. And I think now, especially in the last 10 years, the age of the iPhone, and this one I'm guilty of. I am so guilty of this one, which is going to bed and feeling like I'm relaxing by sitting there at night and, checking something online on my phone or whatnot. Speak to me about what your research, all your hard work has taught us about this device usage at night, having too much light at night. And, I've had a lot of people come back to me and they want to talk about the blue light issue. Frame some of these topics together so that people can understand what you have learned.
So there are at least 3 ways that those gadgets will disrupt your sleep. The first is using them before sleep. For example, studies done where if you read on an iPad for 1 hour before bed, relative to just reading a book in dim light, the iPad will actually block the release of a critical sleep timing hormone called melatonin. And you need melatonin to rise in the evening to help tell your brain when it is time to fall asleep. And when it's at a high concentration, that's when your brain is instructed to get sleep, sort of time the onset of sleep. Well, if you're using those blue light devices, your brain is fooled into thinking it's still daytime. And so it puts the brakes on that hormone called melatonin, and melatonin is not released. And therefore, you're not going to feel sleepy. And in fact, it will delay the rise of that melatonin by up to 3 hours. So in other words, if I'm here in California, in Berkeley, and I read for an hour on my iPad, my peak melatonin, which should normally be present for me probably around about 10 o'clock in the evening, that's not going to arrive until 1 a.m. In other words, I'm now on Hawaii time. It puts me there in terms of a time zone. So that's the first problem with these devices, the blue light. It's actually light of all kinds, by the way. Blue light is especially damaging, but even just normal indoor lighting, I think the recommendation to people would be try turning down half of the lights in your house in the last hour before you go to bed. you may be surprised at how sleep enhancing and how tired and good your sleep becomes when you do that, and certainly doing away with the gadgets. The two other ways that these devices become problematic with sleep, the first is what we call sleep procrastination. It is a thing, which means that you get into bed, you've got your phone by your side or your iPad, and you're sleepy. You could fall asleep just fine, but you think, oh, I should maybe just check email one last time. I should just post on Twitter one last time, or I'll check Facebook, or I'll do Amazon, or those things quickly add up, and all of a sudden you look at the clock and now it's 30 minutes later and you've just lost half an hour of sleep. That sleep procrastination becomes a problem. The final thing is what we call anticipatory anxiety. Many people listening probably have had that feeling where if you've got a really early morning flight that is absolutely critical, let's say it's for a job interview and you've got to make that flight, you know for a fact that you're not going to sleep well the night before. You may fall asleep and stay asleep, but the depth of your sleep is just not as deep.
I hate this. It drives me crazy. This is the one I'm most guilty of.
It's an awful thing. But what happens when you leave your phone there, even if you're good and you put it into airplane mode, just that fact, because most people, if you look at the data, the first thing that most people do when they wake up in the morning, they swipe, they unlock, and then this world of anxiety comes flooding in. Emails, text messages, tweets, all of these things which ramp up the fight or flight branch of your nervous system, which is what causes anxiety and stress. Just knowing that that's what you have to look forward to each and every morning is a low-grade form of that early morning flight that is absolutely essential. And the studies have demonstrated that the depth of your sleep is not as deep when you're anticipating that anxiety the next morning. So those are the three ways that technology has been a problem in terms of the bedroom.
You know, switching back to the biology part here, I had a guest on this show years back named Sharon Moalim, and the subtitle of his book was How Our Genes Change Our Lives and How Our Lives Change Our Genes. Professor, the floor is yours to explain to people on a very, very micro level what's going on when we have this lack of sleep to our genes, our DNA.
That's perhaps some of the most frightening data that we've seen come out recently, which is that if increasing your risk for developing things like cancer or Alzheimer's disease were not sufficiently disquieting enough, we have since discovered that a lack of sleep will even erode the very fabric of biological life itself, which is your DNA genetic code. And in one study, they actually took a group of otherwise completely healthy adults and they limited them to 1 week of 6 hours of sleep. And then they measured the change in their gene activity profile relative to those very same subjects when they were getting 8 hours of sleep. And there were two critical findings. The first was that a sizable and significant 711 genes were changed in their activity caused by that insufficient sleep, which is relevant, by the way, not just in terms of its number, but also because of the sleep manipulation. We're not talking about total sleep deprivation here. A lot of people are trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less during the week. So this is what I would say is ecologically relevant. In other words, it's relevant to most people's lives in terms of an experimental change. The second result perhaps was even more important. About half of those genes were actually suppressed in their activity. The other half were actually amplified in their activity. Those genes that were suppressed were genes that were related to numerous aspects of your immune system. So in other words, you start to become immune deficient at a genetic level by way of 6 hours of sleep for 1 week. Those genes that were actually amplified or over-exaggerated in terms of their expression were genes that were related to the promotion of tumors, genes that were associated with long-term chronic inflammation within the body, and genes that were associated with stress and, as a result, cardiovascular disease. I think, the take-home message for me from those types of findings is that many people in the public feel uncomfortable about the idea of, let's say, genetically modified food or even genetically modified embryos. But by choosing to get insufficient sleep, we now must all accept that we are performing a similar genetic modifying experiment on ourselves. And if we don't let our children get the sleep that they need, we are inflicting a similar genetic engineering experiment on them as well.
You mentioned we are choosing, and that was something that happened in my Facebook thread, is several people said, well, they kind of were saying, I'm not choosing this. I just can't get it. They weren't even allowing themselves to step back and say, hold on, let's do an inventory here. What is my routine and what's an optimal routine? And let's see if I can make some changes to get to the optimal routine. They weren't even considering that. It was just, I can't sleep well.
Yeah. And for some people, they may actually be, very good in terms of their dedication to an 8-hour sleep opportunity every night. But they may be suffering from, probably the second most common sleep disorder, which is, it's probably the most common, which is insomnia. There are two forms of insomnia, one that we call sleep onset insomnia. The other is called sleep maintenance insomnia. They're not mutually exclusive. In other words, you find it difficult to fall asleep or you find it difficult to stay asleep. And those are hugely problematic. We know that the prevalence rates are somewhere between 12 to 15%. 1 out of every 10 people that you walk past on the street has clinical grade insomnia. And actually, it's very difficult to get a diagnosis because the threshold clinically to have a diagnosis of insomnia is very, very difficult. If you scale that back and relax the threshold a little bit, what we know is that 1 out of every 2 people, every 2 adults in most societies report struggling with their sleep at least once a week. Testament to that is the fact that here in America, in the last month, 10 million people will have swallowed some kind of sleep aid, which is, to me, just one of the most profound demonstrations of how desperate people are for sleep. Another way to phrase this is that, it took George Lucas with the Star Wars franchise, I think about 40 years to amass about $4 billion in profit in revenue generation. Well, it took Ambien less than 2 years to generate that same $4 billion in profit.
It's also blocking in other ways, not unlike alcohol and marijuana too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other conversation to have. And it was probably one of the most debated with my publishers chapters in the book. In the book, there is an entire chapter on sleeping pills and whether you should or should not take them. And I make some quite significant claims, but it's all backed up in the science, and the legal team released it. It was solid. What we firstly know is that sleeping pills, like alcohol, are also sedatives. They're called sedative hypnotics. And again, sedation is not the same as sleep. But we also know that the depth of the deep sleep that you get when you're on those drugs isn't the same. So you don't feel as refreshed. You can often feel groggy the next day. Perhaps what was more concerning and what caused the problems or concerns with the book was that there is now very good evidence that sleeping pills are associated with a significantly higher risk of death as well as cancer. And it is considerably higher. There was one study that looked at 20,000 controls versus 10,000 people taking sleeping pills. What they found was that if you are taking sleeping pills, you're about 3 to 4 times more likely to die across a 2.5-year period than those people who are not taking sleeping pills. It doesn't take much. Even just 5 pills to something like 30 pills a year still increased your death risk by almost 200%.
I don't know if I've ever had a conversation with someone, and I've seen some of your work already. It's the biggest PSA ever. I mean, it's like just amazing information. Look, I know you're not the only guy involved in the research, but you're a big leader right now, and it's just amazing. I mean, this should cause people to shake. Like, how did I not know this? Why are we not talking about this? Why do all my family members and friends not know about this? Everyone should know about this.
Yeah, and I think, that was what was heartwarming in reading a lot of the comments on the reviews of the book on websites like Amazon, etc., was how eye-opening it was for people and how they became essentially, sleep ambassadors themselves. They were just so struck, and they would say, I just can't stop telling everyone about this critical necessity of sleep. I'm buying the book for people. I'm sending them all of this information because when you understand, how essential it is, sleep is Mother Nature's best effort yet at immortality. it is the greatest healthcare system that you could ever wish for. And it is, for the most part, democratically available to everyone. And that's why I continue to fight for this thing called sleep. And I am so keen to reunite humanity with the sleep that it is so bereft of. Because, I don't want people to suffer. And I also know just economically, it makes a huge amount of sense. And I could give you one very easy, simple example. We know that if you are getting just 5 hours of sleep a night in the week before you get your flu shot, you will only produce about 50% of the normal antibody response, rendering that flu vaccination largely useless. And we know, for example, in America, that the flu costs the economy about $10 billion directly. It's about $100 billion indirectly, all told. If we could simply just get, by way of maybe sleep trackers and intelligent software, people sleeping sufficiently in the week before they get their flu shot, we could dramatically alter deaths as well as morbidity associated with every single flu season. And it would germinate productivity in the workplace because you're not losing those days of sickness.
Let me give you a kind of fun one in the middle of this conversation. So years ago, in my mid-20s, I was going down this path of having conversations and talking with masters of the universe traders on Wall Street. And I remember I went to this one guy's office in Stamford, Connecticut. His name was Mark. So if he's listening, hopefully he will laugh. I won't say his last name, but he was a big guy. He's like 6'5". We sat down, we had this nice conversation. He was so cool, gave me all these insights as a guy kind of coming along that really didn't know how any of this stuff worked. And he told me in the middle of our conversation that he had a process for working on new problems and learning. And he would take this, whatever he was working on, with him, and he would lay down at night to go to bed. He'd be thinking about it, and he'd put a little piece of paper and a pencil next to his bed, and he would work on it while he slept, and then he would wake up in the morning and he'd write down notes or something. And I remember thinking, as like a 25, 26-year-old guy, I remember thinking, okay, I don't know how this all works. Okay, this guy's really, really smart. He's really successful, but this sounds really freaking nuts. This doesn't sound normal. And I remember thinking, like, okay, I don't know how to really, I don't know where to put this one. But, now I'm going through your work and I'm kind of like, you know what? I think I know where to put this.
Yeah. And there's a reason that you've never been told to stay awake on a problem. And we know from good scientific data that sleep can actually produce about a 3-fold increase in creativity and problem solving. These studies have been well performed. We've done a lot of these studies too on sleep and creativity. And there's lots of wonderful anecdotes to support that too. Musical anecdotes. We know that McCartney had some great compositions. Let It Be came to him in a dream. We know that Keith Richards would go to sleep with a cassette recorder and his guitar in his bed, and probably a lot of other things in his bed at the time as well. But let's set that aside for a second, because he knew that sleep could at some point just grip him with creative insight. And in fact, he reports in his autobiography that the opening chords to Satisfaction, the most famous Rolling Stones song, actually came to him in terms of dream-inspired insight. He said that, every night he would press record and then he would go to sleep. And the next morning he woke up and he rewound the tape. He played it back and he said, there in some ghostly image were the opening chords of Satisfaction that I'd played in the middle of the night, followed by about 43 minutes of snoring. But it did come to him, gifted by way of sleep. This idea that what sleep, and specifically it seems to be dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, dream sleep is a form of informational alchemy. It's during dream sleep that the brain takes all of the recently learned information and then starts to collide it and intersect it with all of your back catalog of information. So you start to test out new associations, you start to seek new connections, and you wake up with a revised mind-wide web that is capable of divining incredible ideas and solutions to previously impenetrable problems.
Let me take you to something else that happened in my thread. And I had one guy that was trying to make the case that younger people literally don't need the sleep. And you have done some work and you've put some studies together, perhaps other research too that you've brought in and aggregated. The school start time. That one is one of those aha moments that should cause parents to just go, oh my God, OMG, as they might say in Saigon, Vietnam, Troy, oi. It's one of those ones. And talk about the school start time and connect it with some of the research on the SATs.
So I think in, 10 or 15 years' time, we will look back and we will be desperately ashamed about the earliness of school start times, because the data is fast accumulating, and I think it is now unequivocal. One of the earliest studies that looked at this happened in America, in Minnesota, and they shifted their school start times from 7:25 to 8:30 in the morning. And the first thing to note, by the way, about that is, what are we doing trying to educate our next generation at 7:25 in the morning? It's clearly not a good idea, because for a 7:25 start, school buses will begin leaving at 5:30 in the morning, which means that some kids are having to wake up at 5:15 or 5 o'clock or even earlier, which to me is utter lunacy. But to get back to the study, they looked at the SAT scores. In the year before they made the time change, when kids were going to school at 7:25 in the morning, the average SAT score of the top performers was 1,288, which it turns out is a very respectable score. The following year, when they were going to school at 8:30 in the morning, the average SAT score was 1,500, which is a 212-point increase. In other words, that will dramatically change which tier of university those kids go to, and as a consequence, their ultimate life trajectory. I think people have questioned some aspects of that early study, perhaps for good reason. But in all of the subsequent studies that we've done, the data now, I think, is very clear. Academic grades increase, behavioral problems decrease, truancy rates also decrease, and then we also see psychiatric and psychological problems. They too also decrease dramatically.
It's just one of these things where when you start to wrap your mind around how many of these different variables that we are in control over, that we mess up on, and how it affects our lives. I mean, look, here's another one, daylight savings time. I currently am in a culture, a country that doesn't operate with it, so the time changes. But if I'm in this country for a year, then 6 months of the year, I'm plus 11 hours East Coast US, and 6 months of the year, I'm plus 12. Daylight savings time, pretty much from what I can tell from your work, is not a good thing.
It can be a killer, unfortunately. Well, and I think daylight savings time is probably the largest global sleep experiment that happens. It's performed essentially on 1.6 billion people across about 70 countries twice a year, of course. And what you find if you look at the data is in the spring, when we lose an hour of sleep, there is a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks. But in the autumn, in the fall, when we gain an hour of sleep, there's a 21% reduction in heart attacks as a result. So I think that's how vulnerable our bodies are to even just 1 hour of lost sleep across one single night, let alone several hours of lost sleep across weeks, months, if not years.
As we wind down here, Matthew, I want to bring it back to something we talked about at the very beginning. We were talking about testosterone. We were talking about men. And you brought up the numbers talking about what happens in terms of your testosterone production going down. But I've seen you make the case in public too. It's also a size issue. Literally, there is a testicle size issue going on with a lack of sleep. Why don't you really get very graphic there so my male friends out there can perhaps even wrap their arms around this even more?
Yeah, not only is a lack of sleep going to sort of be emasculating at the level of testosterone, but men who sleep 5 to 6 hours a night do have significantly smaller testicles than those who sleep 8 hours or more. We also know that they have more deformities in terms of their sperm. And it's not just men, by the way. It's also, we see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health caused by insufficient sleep. And that's why, from a very non-humor perspective, if you have a young couple that's trying to conceive, but they're both not getting sufficient sleep, that's a very difficult challenge because of these demonstrable changes in the reproductive system caused by a lack of sleep.
Hey, one last thing too. This is really, I think, a really important one for people to consider. Statistics is a very difficult subject for people. And when I posted this comment, somebody came back and they said, well, look at this guy, David Wells. He was a pitcher for the Yankees. He was very overweight and he would go out and party every night. And he pitched a perfect game, and he said, like 3 or 4 hours sleep or something. And so this person comes onto my, Facebook and says, well, look at David Wells. Look at this example. And I think people really need to grasp the idea of a bell curve and not just go hunting. And you've already said this in this podcast, not just go hunting for that extreme outlier, because if everyone imagines themselves being the outlier, then it's just illogical. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Outliers, are usually used for confirmation bias to support your own, predilection. And that's always dangerous. You should always just be open to the data, and I think with sleep, one of the other issues to keep in mind too is that the number of people who can, well, actually, let me say it this way. A lack of sleep is going to get you one way or another, and it can get you acutely or it can get you chronically. One way that lack of sleep will pop you out the gene pool and end your life very quickly is drowsy driving. We know that insufficient sleep causes more car accidents than either drugs or alcohol combined. And we know that is far more deathly as well as a consequence. The reason is because when you have what's called a micro sleep behind the wheel, where you just the brain essentially just falls into a sleep state for just a second or two, at that point, you tend to make no reaction at all to an accident potential event. Whereas when you're drunk or you're intoxicated, you're just making an action that is too late, but you're still making an action. That's why insufficient sleep is much more deathly from a road traffic accident perspective. So firstly, if you're bragging about, maybe outliers or, people may be able to get away with it for one day in terms of driving, but it can get you acutely in that way. The other thing, though, is chronically. That's how a lack of sleep will ultimately impact most people. And a good example here is hypertension. A lot of people don't know that they have high blood pressure, and they can be doing the wrong things for year after year after year. And they say, well, look, I'm smoking and I drink and, I kind of eat lousy food, but look at me. I'm strong as an ox and I'm still standing here in front of you. But then 10 years later, they suffer a massive coronary or they die of a brain hemorrhage because of a stroke due to that hypertension. It's the same way with sleep. You don't know you're not getting sufficient sleep when you're not getting sufficient sleep. You're not aware of it, but it will get you, unfortunately. The elastic band of sleep deprivation will stretch only so far before it snaps.
I got to share with you really quick, really fun little story I did when I was like 20 years old. I was driving from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. It's about a 20-hour drive. I didn't know anything about how sleep would affect my body or whatnot. So I figured, okay, I'll try to sleep during the day and I'll start driving at 11 o'clock at night. I'll take a bunch of Vivarin, I thought, okay, I can just drive all the way through the night to get to New Orleans. I got to about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and I was passed out in my car on the side of the road. So,
well, and that's the right thing to do. It's just not worth it. Either you could lose your own life or you could take someone else's life.
The book, Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. Matthew, where's the best place beyond Amazon where people should go buy this book? This is one of those books that you should, I actually just bought 3 copies for my family and just sent it to them. Where should people go to check you out? Where's the best place beyond a Google search? They can find you everywhere. But is there a website?
I do. I have a website and I'm on social media and it's all Sleep Diplomat. So I'm on Twitter at Sleep Diplomat. I'm on the web. Sleepdiplomat.com. The same thing in terms of LinkedIn. So people will find me there, unfortunately or fortunately.
You've sure picked a topic that I think most rational people, most rational people, I'm not sure calling humans rational is smart, but for most rational people out there, this is one of those topics that's pretty universal. So, hey, listen, I appreciate the work and best of luck and can't wait to see all the new things you figure out in the years to come.
Thank you so much and a privilege to be on the show, Mike. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake
will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.